Okay, well, all right. So then, so let's get started then. I feel like this is about a quorum as we will ever have. And I am so super happy to see everybody that's here, especially Doug, to talk about his great book. I want to hand it over to Elise, who is the person who has organized this and who invited Doug to speak about his book. And so, Elise, it is yours.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'm Elise Koffler, chair of the Performing Arts section this year. Of what's a regular series of virtual meetings. Although we already have a couple lined up, we'd love to see you all participate in the future.
Oh, you're dropping out a little bit.
We'll be asking your feedback for scheduling format, ideas for speakers, ideas for topics. But today, we're grateful for Doug for agreeing to jump right in and get us off to a great start. So if you want to introduce Doug.
I would love to introduce Doug. Okay. Doug Reside is the curator of the Billy Rose Theater Division at New York Public Library and manages all aspects of the division's collections and public services. He joined the New York Public Library in 2011 as first as the digital curator for the performing arts before assuming his current position in 2014. Prior to joining the New York Public Library, Reside served on the directorial staff of the Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities at the University of Maryland. He has published and spoken on topics related to theater history, literature, and digital humanities, and has managed several large grant-funded projects on these topics. Reside is especially interested in the use of digital forensic tools to study the creative process. What a great topic. Oh my God. He received a PhD in English from the University of Kentucky, and his book, Fixing the Musical, was published on September 8th, 2023. So in paperback by Oxford University Press. So Fixing the Musical, How Technologies Shape the Broadway Repertory. Hold that book up for everyone to see so they know what they're looking for when they go to the store. And thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you. Because we are a smaller group, I wonder if it makes sense to let everybody just say their name and where they're from if you feel comfortable. I don't know if people want to be called out in the audience, but I'd like to know who you are. If you can say, you can just say pass or not turn your mic on if you don't want to, but.
I'll start. Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm also in the theater division at Library for the Performing Arts.
In the archives of Brooklyn Academy of Music.
I'm Sherwood, work at Texas.
Our public library, but I work at the Tompkins Square branch.
Hi, I'm Susan Brady, performing arts archivist for the Beinecke Library at Yale University, retired happily.
Hey, I'm Patsy Gay. I work in the archives at Jacobs Fellow. Happy to be here. Excited.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. So I'm going to try to share my screen and we'll see how this goes. Let's see. Good. Okay. And hopefully you can still see me, so that's great. Okay. So this book, as was said earlier, came out in September. It's was written over the last couple of years. It in some ways came out of my dissertation, which is now almost 15, well, I guess even 20 years old, which looked at an approach to editing musical theater in the same way that we edit Shakespeare and Greek texts and texts where there's a lot of different, what they call them, textual critical studies, witnesses to a thing. And then in looking at the very collaborative and multimodal forms in which musical theater comes to be. So this book really kind of stems or grows out of that discussion to look at the different media forms that are used, that are commercially sold and that help define musical theater. So if you don't know, musical theater scholarship has, over the last couple of decades, risen from the margins of musicology and pop culture studies into a legitimate field with its own journals and conferences. As far as there's at least one new organization of musical theater studies that's just been founded, and there's another one that sort of is forming right now out of the Association for Theater and Higher Education. And there's subgroups of well, a lot of the different major conferences in pop culture, in music, in musicology, and in theater studies. But authors of works such as my own book might only a few years ago have spent most of their first chapter defending their subject's worthiness of the insignia of an academic wing of a press like Oxford's. Today, though, as I said, there are several important book series dedicated to the field. There's the new organizations, and while the suspicion of the musical continues in many countries outside of the United States and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom, it is now a fact that academics are paid and published and promoted in even prestigious institutions for studying musical theater. The reasons for this shift from kind of the margins into the legitimate part of the academy are many, but today I will argue that musicals became important in an academic sense in the late 20th century because for the first time they could be studied in the scholarly solitude that plays such as Shakespeare's or novels that are in English departments have been studied since the beginning of the English major in the late 19th century. So as a child in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri in the 1980s, I spent many Saturdays browsing through the LP and cassette collections of cast recordings cataloged, I'm afraid, as soundtracks in the county library, pictured here in the Florissant Valley County Library. Often as I listened to these LPs or cassettes, the plot was all but incomprehensible from the album alone. So if I enjoyed the music, I might go to the shelves, the nonfiction shelves, and check out the libretto. I never quite understood why the libretto was nonfiction, but there it was. Later, my parents bought their first VHS player, and I regularly also checked out video recordings of live productions and movie adaptations to get a sense of what these musicals that I'd listened to on disc might have looked like on the stage, or at least on film. This is not, I've learned as I've worked on this book, an uncommon experience among musical theater fans who grew up in the late 20th century. Browsing cast recordings in the public library, which in Middle America was a venue much more likely to have cast recordings than the average American mall's record store, seems to have been something like a rite of passage for this tribe before streaming services threw open the doors to virtually the entire catalog of American music. St. Louis, I should note, is and still was and still is a remarkably theater-rich town. The Muni, for those of you who don't know, is a century-old municipal opera company that produces a slate of about half a dozen musicals each summer, and an outdoor amphitheater that can seat close to 11,000. This is only a portion of the entire auditorium or the entire amphitheater pictured here. It also offers 1,000 seats for free on a first-come, first-served basis. Equity tours of shows, current Broadway shows regularly stop at the Fox. I saw my first equity production, well, my first touring equity production there. And Scott Miller's A New Line Theater, which is still emerging in my own adolescence, often premieres regional productions of smaller Broadway shows, including, I think here it's maybe Be More Chill, I'm not quite sure. So maybe Assassins, actually, it looks like. Although productions at these venues certainly informed my understanding of the repertory of musical theater, the ability to replay, reread, and rewatch the records, books, and videos from the library did more for me than these local regional seasons to establish an understanding of the important works of American and British music. It also seemed to me in my youth that the texts that are preserved on paper, tape, and disc in the library are or were actually more authentic than those I might have heard on or seen on stage. In part, I think this is the experience of going to amateur original theater. Mistakes are often made in live performance, but the recordings, I thought, represented the accurate representation of authorial intent. This is not, it turns out, an accurate understanding of authorial intention, but the legal importance of recordings over and above live performance is actually recognized and protected by the United States copyright law, which states that it only applies to original works of authorship, which are, and here's the key point, fixed in any tangible medium of expression, now or later developed, from which they can be perceived, reproduced, or otherwise communicated. That is, a live performance, if it is only live performance, cannot be copyrighted. If I didn't have a tangible expression of this talk in a book, or I guess if it wasn't recorded on Zoom, it wouldn't, the simple words that I spoke today wouldn't be protected by copyright law until they were transcribed. And under this code, performance only becomes intellectual property when it is fixed in a tangible medium of expression. The rise of the American musical coincided with the proliferation of new tangible media of expression capable of fixing the very multimodal form of musical theater. So in my book, I explore the impact that the technologies had that were used, I explore the impact that the technologies used to fix musical theater works had on the art form from 1866 with The Black Crook to around 2022 when I finally submitted the manuscript to Oxford. Each new technology, from cheaper and faster printing to photography, audio recording, video recording, and virtual and augmented reality, have highlighted different elements of the work and make possible new kinds of musicals. The repertory of musical theater, of course, changes over time. So when I talk about the shows that are established, I'm generally talking about the shows that get performed a lot. And I needed to figure out exactly a kind of base level of what those shows are. I was interested not in the so-called what is the best that has been thought and said, in the words of, I think it was Coleridge, one of the 19th century or the Romantic poets, but instead the shows that are most likely to have been seen. And to do that, I compiled a list of all the shows that have been performed at these theaters. These are regional theaters that perform a season with at least 2 musicals a year, and often many more. So at these theaters, I looked through their records and counted up the number of times each musical had been performed there. And these are the most performed musicals at those theaters. Now, Oxford in the book, I'm not quite sure how they represented the chart, but it goes down the columns like this. So Fiddler on the Roof was the most performed, Sound of Music second, South Pacific third. And again, I compiled this list in, I think, late 2020. So it's a little surprising. I mean, of course, the older shows will have had longer to catch on, but it still is a fairly traditional list as you go down. And yet there are still newer titles in here as well. The Arthur Kopit's Phantom, not the Andrew Lloyd Webber Phantom, the Arthur Kopit Phantom is among the most performed musicals as well. And as you go further down the list, you can start to see shows that are much newer. Certainly Hairspray, the stage version of Beauty and the Beast are shows that are performed. I think all of the ones on this list are performed more than 40 times. Any list like this will have omissions that grate against the expertise of a particular historian, and perhaps you might object to the methodology I used. But I do feel like these titles represent a reasonable inventory of those musicals that the average American theater goer would have had half a chance to have seen in a professional production over the last 50 years or so. These musicals entered the repertory I propose in the book because the media technologies in use when they premiered captured enough of the work that it could be known and loved by audiences, most of whom would not have seen the first production. Today, I'm going to necessarily excerpt just a few bits of several chapters from my book to look at cheap printing, the audio cassette, and the VHS tape, and how these media shaped the Broadway repertory and elevated the form as a serious work of art that could be studied in the Academy. I begin with printing, which when I've talked about the book, eyebrows often raise when I mention this is the technology that I begin with. But of course, it is a technology. We're not born with printing presses on our hands. And while the printing press has been around for centuries, the kind of printing press that was really suited for making the musical didn't really begin to develop until the late 19th century, and was really that process was begun by this guy, Alois Sennefelder. Those German-speaking among you will correct my pronunciation, I'm sure, after the talk. But he was actually, interestingly, a playwright who was interested in 1791 in moving from his sort of failed law practice to pursuing a career in the theater. He'd actually written a couple of plays, which he said had some success regionally, but he wanted to get them performed on larger stages. And the Leipzig Easter Fair was coming up, which was sort of a big book fair in his region. It still happens today, actually. But the printer that he engaged to get the books, the copies of his script ready for the Easter Fair, didn't complete the books in time. And so he was sort of completely heartsick about this and struggled to find another printer, but he couldn't find one who was willing to do it as quickly as he needed and for the price that he was able to afford. He writes in his sort of history of his own memoirs, my hope of profit was lost. I had, however, seen the entire procedure of printing because I had spent many a day in the establishments. And so he decided to become a printer himself, but he lacked the capital to build a press. And so he needed to find a new technology for printing more quickly and more cheaply. And so after a series of experiments, he invented a process whereby a particular kind of ink inscribed on slabs of cheap limestone, which were readily available in the area of Germany where he lived, and then washed with acid, could be used to rapidly and cheaply produce printing plates. And because these weren't movable type plates, but rather could represent whatever was sort of etched, or etched is the wrong word, but put onto the stone, it could be not just text, but also music. And in fact, he collaborated with a musical composer, Franz Gleisner, and after many experiments and soul-crushing setbacks, which he details in his memoirs, he developed a method for relatively quick and inexpensive high-quality printing, which we now know as lithography. And this, of course, could be, as I said, could be used to print not just text, but also music and images. And printing technologies continued to develop over the 19th century until finally in the early 20th century, in May of 1932, the first American musical theater libretto was printed and sold. It was the musical of Wie I Sing, the Gershwin, Kaufman, and Riskin piece, and was selected by George Jean Nathans for the series The Theater of Today. The Theater of Today was an experiment, really, to see if printed cheap non-Shakespeare, contemporary theater could be sold and at least make back the money that was used to print them. And I believe that it was possible to make a profit on, or at least to take the risk on, the text of Wie I Sing because of the technology that was used to print this book. On the very last page of this book, if you turn to the last page, you'll see this long note describing in great detail the printing technology used to make it. It says that this book has been set on the linotype, and then it talks about the font. And then importantly, at the very end, it says that it was composed, printed, and bound by the Vale-Pellew Press. So the two bits of information to look at here are the word composed and the word linotype. So if you don't know, a linotype is a technology dated back to really the late 19th century, where and first used by the Vale-Pellew Press in 1900. And it's created by someone that essentially uses strips of molten metal and then types with something like a typewriter that you can see here to create indentations of the string of text that is then assembled into plates to make the printed book. It's something like if you ever had those plastic dial things that you would send a sticker through, a line of a sticker, and then print something for your file cabinet or your sister's forehead. You could experience something like linotyping. Now, it was originally used predominantly for newspapers, and it wasn't thought to be good enough for serious books. But by 1908, the Vale-Pellew Press had been able to use linotyping to create a quality that was considered sufficient enough for books. It's still, though, used, and so the linotypes, the metal plates that were printed, were not strong enough for a long print run, even a fairly short run of a couple of thousand books. And so they tended to use the linotype prints to transfer them to other plates through a process called electrotyping, an electromechanical process called electrotyping. That was a very expensive process that I won't get into here. But there was another method that was a lot cheaper, where they used paper mache to create the molds from the linotype metal strips, and then flip that over and fill the paper mache with metal to create the new plates. And this was represented a substantial reduction in the plate costs. Now, it had been used by newspapers, but one of the staff members at the Avail Blue Press, a guy named McGarity, had perfected it for book printing in the 1930s, just around the time that this book came out. And all of the editions of the Theater of Today before of Thee I Sing have the words here, instead of composed, printed, and bound, it says electrotyped, printed, and bound. But here they genericize that word electrotyped to composed, which makes me, which leads me to believe that this book was one of the very first in the series to follow the cheaper stereotyping method. And this was important, of course, because the book was really a risk. The introduction to Of Thee I Sing includes a note from the editor saying that you can't read this book in the same way that you would read a novel or even another kind of play. You have to essentially engage your mind and your imagination a lot more. He says to jauntily tip your imaginary top hat and imagine the dancers and the performers on the stage, because so much of the musical is not actually encoded in the text, but is is parts of other, is not part of the text itself, but are other things of the musical. So the musical actually continued to be printed into the 1940s. Bennett Cerf, an editor at Random House, who's pictured here, was he created something called I forget what the title was actually, but he started printing. Oh no, he didn't have a title for the series, but he just started printing a lot of plays in his series. He was a fan of theater, and he said that the speed of publication for printing plays was important because in the 6 weeks that it takes to produce a book, the original excitement over the play has largely died down, especially in the New York area. However, the plays that he printed could be sent out to out-of-town tours, and many of the out-of-town New York book reviewers and drama critics use these printed Random House plays to help them review the plays or even prepare for the play as it comes into town. He did acknowledge that he prints these plays mostly for the fun of it. That is, he didn't really get a profit from the books, but that he said he almost never lost money on a copy. They almost always made back the relatively little amount of money needed to print copies. But that quick printing, he acknowledged, was really important. He also was able to use these cheaper technologies to create the first anthology, single-authored anthology of an American series of librettos, the 6 plays by Rodgers and Hammerstein, which is printed by Random House and then also printed under their Modern Library imprint in 1959. The Modern Library, in the words of the promotional text on the dust jackets, presents outstanding contributions to literature of the past and present in authoritative editions at a price within everyone's reach. This book then presented the works of Rodgers and Hammerstein alongside other important works of American theater or American literature. Lise M. Jalliant has written about the valorizing effects of the Modern Library on the canonization of many modernist authors, including Willa Cather. And so printing Rodgers and Hammerstein alongside Willa Cather, but also playwrights such as Tennessee Williams and Eugene O'Neill, gave a sort of importance to Rodgers and Hammerstein and to the musical theater, and made Rodgers and Hammerstein preeminent in that form. Larry Maslon has recently extended the anthologization of the libretti of musical theater with his 2-volume Library of America set, which further elevated musical theater as something that deserved to be in the Library of America. You know, the idea is that books printed in the Library of America imprint should always stay in print. They have an endowment to make sure their books never go out of print. And and that these 16 musicals that he put within that series are part of the repertory or the canon. Now, in the early to mid 20th century, musicals could be printed and distributed even more quickly and cheaply in niche magazines that began to emerge, that are sometimes called the modernist magazines. One of these, I guess I don't have an image for it, was the Theater Arts magazine. And in spring of 1948, Theater Arts combined with Stage, another theater magazine, and promised to offer, as part of their new format, complete and unabridged publications of some recently produced stage successes. So every issue, Theater Arts magazine printed a new script. The majority of the works that they published were, as may be expected, straight plays, but at least once a year, they did publish musical or opera libretti, and actually most often musical theater libretti. And these were the titles they printed. The editors showed remarkable prescience in the judgment, prescience of the judgment and the titles that they selected. I mean, that all but Lost in the Stars, Once Upon a Mattress, and Double Entry, which is actually a double bill of two short musicals, have been performed frequently enough to have been included in that regional repertory that I listed at the beginning. But at the time that the magazine printed the titles, they were all relatively new. The decision of the editors of this magazine to include musical theater libretti without apology as part of their monthly publication of a script also made it clear that musical theater was an essential part of dramatic literature in America. While opera libretti, as I said, and in a few cases, scripts written for television or films were sometimes included as part of a special issue that focused on these art forms, musical theater libretti were just included in whatever issue happened to, whatever topic happened to be in that particular issue. So it didn't deserve a special issue. It was just considered as important as the works of Tennessee Williams, Mary Chase, Thornton Wilder, or Arthur Miller, who were all printed in the same venue. Theater Arts ceased publication in 1963, and while later magazines like Show Music occasionally published libretti, and American Theater continues to publish scripts, there's no publication that I know of that has entirely filled the niche that Theater Arts had. It's also interesting that they, Theater Arts, printed lots of sort of proto-musical theater scholarship. Cecil Smith, and actually my own predecessor, George Friedley, occasionally published articles under the topic of what they called lyric theater, which was at that time, Rodgers and Hammerstein in Oklahoma and all those shows, Lerner and Lowe, were discussed as part of these essays on lyric theater in the magazine. And so it also elevated musical theater as something that people could not just read, but talk about with a sort of in serious discussion. Now, of course, as I've said, printed texts only capture a very small portion of the full work of the American musical. And the advent of sound recording in the late 19th century was arguably even more important for musical theater studies. Indeed, a musical theater composer was one of the very first voices to ever be recorded on in a recorded sound on a wax cylinder. In 1888, composer Arthur Sullivan, caricatured in the photo here, was allowed to listen to some wax cylinder audio recordings of one of his songs. It wasn't a musical theater song, it was a more patriotic song. And he responded in this way. I don't think I'm going to risk the audio recording through Zoom, but he said that, for myself, I can only say that I'm astonished and somewhat terrified at the results of this evening's experiment. Astonished at the wonderful form you have developed, and terrified at the thought that so much hideous and bad music will be put on record forever. It's unclear whether Sullivan, who aspired to be a serious composer and had a somewhat ambivalent opinion of the comic operas that made him wealthy and famous, would class his operettas as among the hideous and bad music that would be preserved. But regardless, The Mikado was one of the very first musicals, or at least pieces of music theater, to be recorded on both wax cylinder and later on disc. Music theater songs continued to be recorded in the first decades of the 20th century, and the emergence of the record album, which gathered a set of 10 or 12-inch discs, so they came in different diameters, into a portfolio, which is why we call it a record album. It's because they were originally actually in an album. Helped to define the integrated music, where the songs were all integrated into the story. The reputation of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical Oklahoma as the first musical in which song and dance were tightly integrated into the story is, as many historians have observed, mostly unearned. Lady in the Dark, for instance, cannot be easily distinguished from Oklahoma on the basis of form. It has a dream ballet and a lot of the same kinds of songs. And Pal Joey, to a lesser extent, is sort of the same. But Oklahoma, through a series of events, including a long musician strike, interesting to think about that in terms of our own recent entertainment industry strikes and the technology of artificial intelligence. It was the first musical to really have all of the song or most of the songs included in an album with the original cast and the original orchestra. Cradle Will Rock had the same, but it was essentially a radio play narrated, or almost like an audiobook, where the played on the piano, as he actually did in the after his original production was shut down. In October of 1943, Decca contributed to the Musicians Union's pension fund in order to gain an exemption to the strike, and was able to record Oklahoma with the original cast and orchestra. The album contained 6 10-inch discs, shown here, each playing less than 3 minutes and 30 seconds on a side. So basically each side of the disc was about a song. And they recorded Oklahoma specifically for listeners with record changers. So if you don't remember, or if you perhaps have never seen a record changer, for those that don't know, it used to be you would stack your records, and then there was a sort of mechanism where when it got to the end of the record, the new disc would drop onto the platter and it would begin playing from the beginning. So you could stack up the discs that you wanted to listen to without having to walk over to the player to change each one. So Oklahoma put side 1 on the first side, and then side 2 was on the second disc, the first side of the second disc, and side 3 was on the first side of the third disc, and so on. And then they reverse on the B sides. The result is that there is a very defined order of songs in this album. And so the musical began to be seen as a sort of integrated whole, where each song had to be where it was to tell the story that was in the musical. It's interesting, actually, though, that Carousel, when it came out, they followed the same pattern, but the song Soliloquy, where Billy Bigelow has learned that he's going to have a child and ruminates on what he might do with his son, or then he has the revelation that he could in fact have a daughter. That song is about 6 minutes in length, and so wouldn't have fit on one side of the discs. And so the music publisher, or the record label, didn't want to separate the song over 2 discs. So in other words, if you wanted to listen to just Soliloquy, they wanted to make it possible to just listen to that disc and then flip it over and listen to the second side. But to do that, they actually had to move Soliloquy up a couple of slots in the order of the songs. And the result is that it almost sounds like Billy Bigelow has learns that he's going to have a child before he marries Julie Jordan. And this perhaps was so scandalous that the only song that is listed by title in the liner notes is Soliloquy, where the liner notes clearly identified where the song fits in the order that is different, actually, than where it might appear to fit in the record album. But when the LP came out, it moved the song. It didn't move the song, rather. It kept the song in more or less the same order that it was in the 78 style, and also the movie version likewise kept the song in basically the same place. It moved the song up earlier in the set of songs. In the years that followed, new technologies such as the LP, which could hold about 45 minutes on a disc, 45s, which were much smaller but also much less breakable than the 78s, stereo LPs, cassettes, CDs, and later MP3s, and streaming provided music labels with a repertory-defining opportunity to prioritize certain titles to move from one format to another. So in other words, when the 78s went out of fashion and they had LPs, they were certainly starting to record new songs or new albums onto the LP, but they also started to re-release things that were previously on 78s. And of course, the same happened when the CDs came out and they moved from LPs to CDs. But at each moment, there was sort of a bottleneck for a second, anyway, the first couple of months of the technology, where only the most important musicals that had been transferred or that existed or were considered most important were transferred to the new format. Rodgers and Hammerstein made the transition fairly quickly each time, and so were even further solidified as an important part of the musical theater repertory. The idea of a musical theater classic was established not only through revivals, but also through re-releases of audio recordings. Perhaps the most important new format, though, was the commercial compact cassette and the battery-operated cassette recorder. These technologies were useful, first of all, for allowing people to listen to music not just in their homes, but on the go, either in their cars or as they were exercising. And it also sort of separated the media from the packaging. And so if you listened to the recording of Oklahoma or Carousel, you could follow along with the liner notes on the back of the album and kind of get a sense of what was going on. That wasn't really possible with the cassettes because the type was so incredibly small. You can see even in these images, the type there of the credits is about the size that the lyrics and liner notes would have been. Sometimes you could write away for the larger format liner notes, but it was not included as part of the package. And so the musicals that were popular during this time tended to be those that you could kind of listen to and understand fully from the recording. Shows like Phantom of the Opera, Into the Woods, Les Miserables, or even Cats, you could more or less get a full sense of the show simply by listening to the recording and not by following along with any of the with liner notes. The other thing that cassettes did, though, was it made it possible for the average consumer to record music as well. There had been, of course, reel-to-reel recorders prior to the cassette, but these were not particularly portable. But the cassette recorder allowed people to sneak audio recording devices into theaters in their pockets or their handbags or whatever, and begin to record bootleg recordings of musical theater. These bootlegs arguably contributed to the rise in popularity, I argue, of Stephen Sondheim's musicals in the 1970s. Sondheim's shows were among the most frequently bootlegged on cassette, and many of those who saw the original productions recalled the phenomena of that moment in the shows where audible clicks could be heard as the cassette recorders either stopped altogether or began to record on the other side of the cassette because the cassettes could only hold up to about 45 minutes on one side of a tape. Several bootleggers that I spoke to as part of the research for this book recalled this tape-changing moment in Sweeney Todd or Merrily We Roll Along, almost like an act break, that you knew there was a moment that was when the tape recorders would all click over to the other side. And Sondheim and his colleagues seem to have taken a relatively permissive and sometimes even supportive approach to the production of these recordings. One bootlegger that I spoke to remembers that on the closing night of Pacific Overtures, he says, Boris Aronson was in a wheelchair, and I was in the back of the theater, and choreographer Pat Birch and librettist Hugh Wheeler were standing in the back with me. And I had an extension microphone, and I was holding the machine up, and Boris Aronson wheeled over to me and tapped me on the back and says, "What kind of camera are you using?" Of course, it wasn't a camera, it was a tape recorder, but I'm taping the show and it's the closing performance. And Ruth Mitchell, who was Hal Prince's assistant, tries to stop me from doing it. She jumps up, but Hugh Wheeler and Pat Birch jumped out from behind me and said, let him alone, he's doing it, let him alone. And she did. Another bootlegger recalls that sometimes help even came from the stage. He remembers that when he went to the reading of or the performance of Wise Guys, which was an early version of Bounce or Roadshow or Gold or whatever they called Stephen Sondheim's penultimate musical, at the New York Theater Workshop, he was in the front row, right center, with his two friends on either side. And he had a new kind of recorder that actually automatically turned to the other side, he says, so you could set up a 90-minute cassette and it would go through the whole show. And cast member Nancy Opal was his friend, and she saw him. And she was on stage, and as he remembers, she kind of mimes, "Cover your hand over the microphone. Everybody can see the tape recorder." So with Both the law and some in the theater community intent on creating an artificial scarcity of bootleg recordings, rare copies of bootlegs became signifiers of true fandom, separating the simple aficionado of musicals from the true devotee. In his influential analysis of 20th century flops, nonsense Carrie, that's not the book, I don't have an image. Ken Mandelbaum writes, how can any intelligent person wish to collect catastrophes like Legs Diamond and Kelly, or camp disasters like Home Sweet Home and Whoop Up? Fans of flops know these shows, can sing along with songs from them, and love the kinship they feel with others who know them. Casual followers of the musical may have some idea of why Oklahoma or West Side Story or a chorus line are important, but the world of Breakfast at Tiffany's and Into the Light is a private world, and those who are a part of it can't wait for each new Broadway season to make, as it inevitably does, its own contribution to the flops. Now, of course, there's no binary distinction between casual followers of musicals and fans of flops, but rather a continuum across which knowledge of rare musicals is slowly communicated. Superfans may mention their own acquisition of a particularly rare and valuable bootleg to a simple aficionado, who may in turn mention the title to a casual follower. And so the obscure title begins to accrete notoriety. The economy of bootlegs results in an alternative canon established not by commercial or artistic success, but because the value and rarity of the recordings in the bootleg market makes it seem somewhat important. Now, as with Shakespeare's plays, which were first bootlegged in quarto form, the notoriety of these bootlegs sometimes leads to an official recording. The score of the musical Carrie was tightly controlled by its creators. This is Carrie of the title of Ken Mandelbaum's book, Nonsense Carrie. And it was very hard to get anyone to get permission to do anything from the musical. All new productions were forbidden. But when Napster came out, some of you may remember in the early 2000s, the music sharing site Napster, bootlegs were readily shared on the site. And as awareness of the musical grew, a desire for a production intensified. And in 2012, the creators were finally convinced to permit an off-Broadway revival at the Lucille Lortel Theater. Both Patrick Healy in the New York Times and David Rooney in The Hollywood Reporter mentioned bootlegs in their reviews. The score of Carrie was finally legally recorded by Ghostlight Records, but was powered by the bootlegs that preceded it. Like the original production of Stephen Sondheim's Folly, likewise, the original production of Follies was much bootlegged, both on audio tape and on silent film. The commercially released original cast album was famously disappointing both to audiences and the creators. It was released on a single 50-minute LP and had almost none of the dialogue and a confusing abridgment and rearrangement of the score. The record producer Thomas C. Shepard told Larry Maslon for his book, Broadway to Main Street, if you didn't see the show, you would have no idea what it was about. Nonetheless, the show quickly passed into the musical repertory, along with Company and Sweeney Todd, because there were so many bootlegs. The Lincoln Center concert was not recorded until 1985, and the London production didn't open until 1987, and yet the show remained a cult favorite because fans, if they knew where to look, still had access to the show. Now, by the 1980s, magnetic tape was also used to capture and distribute video recordings of both live theater and movie adaptations for home use. Although it had been possible to record video to tape since the early 1970s, and of course, movie musicals have existed since the beginning of the sound film era, the VHS player and recorder made it possible for these video texts to not only be seen in theaters or perhaps on a very rich person's home movie setup, but also in a middle-class home on a VHS player and recorder. These texts allowed Sondheim's reputation, which was already firmly established in New York by the 1970s, to grow nationally with the commercial release of the video recording of Sweeney Todd, Sunday in the Park with George, Into the Woods, and Passion in the 1980s and early 1990s. Now, even before the emergence of home video, Sondheim had some experience with documenting his stage work on television. Just before closing on Broadway, the original production of Pacific Overtures was filmed for Japanese television. Now, the show was never licensed for American television and has not yet been commercially released, although it's widely available on YouTube. But it perhaps prepared Sondheim and Hal Prince for a request that followed several years later. In 1980, the Nederlanders, who own many of the theaters in New York, sought permission to produce a television capture of Sweeney Todd from the national tour. Television director Terry Hughes, who had previously directed television adaptations of The Gin Game and Huey, but was perhaps best known for his work on The Golden Girls, was hired to lead a project to film Sweeney Todd. He remembers that he went to New York to meet with Sondheim, where the composer told Hughes that he did not conceive of Sweeney as that epic set and that whole Industrial Revolution subtext that Hal Prince wove into it. Sondheim didn't see it as being that epic in size. He was quite excited about doing a television version of it because it would refocus Sweeney Todd the way he intended it as a chamber musical. The television production still had all the production values, but the cameras would focus on the characters and their intimacy and interactions. Hughes said that this conversation gave him insight in how to direct the video recording, which, if you've seen it, does indeed focus very closely on actors rather than the set. In fact, when researchers come to look at the theater and film and tape recording in the New York Public Library, which is filmed focusing much more with wide shots, I often hear people say one forgets how large that set was. This is a Martha Swope photograph of the set as well. And one forgets, I imagine, because one remembers only the VHS recording of the show. Sweeney Todd was released on VHS in 1984, and in 1985, producer Ellen Cass, who worked on the recording, noted that it was just now showing profit. So a year later, it was just now showing profit, perhaps due in part to repeat broadcasts on PBS and Showtime, but also perhaps due to sales to home viewers. Throughout the rest of the 1980s, Sondheim's musicals were the most frequently, he was the most frequent author committed to videotape. Harry Hahn, substituting for gossip columnist Liz Smith while she was on vacation in 1982, notes in her column that Sondheim had been delighted by what had been done to his show Sweeney Todd and immediately gave the Nederlanders carte blanche to cableize any of the other shows that they would like, that is, to show them on cable. The Nederlander television venture did not last long enough for the company to take advantage of this offer, but in 1982, PBS created the similarly intentioned series American Playhouse, and in 1985, producer Michael Brandman approached Terry Hughes to direct the musical Sunday in the Park with George. I'll go back a minute. And of course, Sweeney Todd, Sunday in the Park with George won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama later that year. In the 1986 edition of Craig Zadan's oft-revised History of Sondheim Musicals, Sondheim and Company, Zadan begins, in the 12 years that have passed since the publication of the first edition of my book, Stephen Sondheim has in many respects changed quite a bit. Until recently, he had been a cult figure, hardly a household name. But 8 years later, in the April 4th, 1994 edition of New York Magazine, the table of contents pasted the tongue-in-cheek question, is Stephen Sondheim God? Rising from a cult figure to a divinity in 2 short decades is a remarkable apotheosis, made possible in part by the access television and home recordings provided to his work. The financial realities that pushed the venue for these broadcasts from cable television to PBS also had a valorizing effect on musical theater. On American Playhouse, Sondheim's musicals were produced alongside Eugene O'Neill, Tina Howe, Ntozake Shange, and others, suggesting that he was part of a new repertory of American theater. The abridged video recordings of Follies in Concert in 1986 featured theatrical luminaries, including Carol Burnett, Barbara Cook, Elaine Stritch, Adolph Green, and Betty Comden at the Philharmonic Hall in at Lincoln Center, suggesting to audiences that Follies was about as high art as you could possibly get. By the 1980s, Sondheim's place in the theatrical repertory had been firmly established, and these broadcasts helped to establish him as the pinnacle of the musical theater form. Soon after that, musical theater, beginning with the works of Stephen Sondheim, began to be taken somewhat seriously in musicology and theater departments. Professor Joanne Gordon's dissertation, Art Isn't Easy, The Theater of Stephen Sondheim, was published in 1990, and the University of Michigan Press published Bristol University professor Stephen Banfield's Stephen Sondheim's Broadway musicals in 1993. By the late 1990s, both Yale and Oxford University presses started to publish scholarship in the field regularly. Regardless of the sophistication of Sondheim's work, had it not been for these PBS broadcasts, he may well have remained a cult figure. and the chronically conservative aesthetic of the Academy may have been much slower to adapt and make room for the musical. Indeed, it may not be too much of an overstatement to say that if it were not for the invention of the home movie recorder, home VHS recorder, the permission of Sondheim to allow the technologies to be used to create multimodal texts of his own work that could be studied in the same way as the folio of Shakespeare, we would not be on this call today. There may not be a Oxford series on cast recordings, and my book may never have been published. I'm glad that those involved saw that this issue was fixed. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Wow, thank you so much. So yes, exactly, a virtual round of applause, everybody, for that fabulous presentation. And yeah, so I can moderate. You can moderate questions, folks. Please.
How did you get in contact with the former bootleggers? That's one of the most fascinating chapters in the book.
Yeah, so there's a couple of volunteers who work at the library who were in some of the shows that were bootlegged and who knew of people that were part of that community. And it was sort of a friend of a friend of a friend until I finally got to the people that, well, the first two people that I talked to. And then, of course, they introduced me to all the people that they used to trade with. The book talks about, there used to be a store that some of you may remember, Music Masters in New York, that had a kind of behind the beaded curtain area where you could trade musical theater bootlegs. And so that they formed it in an actual community, really. And so they all still knew each other, and those that were still alive, I could speak to. I'm seeing Suzanne said that the screen didn't show. Was that true? Did you see anything on the screen during the PowerPoint?
It went out for a bit for me, but it came back.
Good. Good.
Maybe that was just the placeholder slides that were black so that it's more comfortable to look at. Is that right? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe, no.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. Okay, maybe it did flicker out.
Any other questions?
I have a question. So I'm curious. Well, I don't know if this is I think I have to formulate it for a second. I'm gonna retreat from that. Give me 1 sec.
I guess the last question got at this a little bit, but I'm so interested in kind of like the intersection between your sort of like library life and your like researcher self, right? Because I feel like we spend so much time facilitating other researchers. And so I'm interested to see sort of like what were the connections for you of like being the steward of collections and then also like being the user of them? And like, were there any interesting sort of intersections or challenges about that?
I mean, I guess one, the biggest challenge was the New York Public Library doesn't really have a research, like I think a lot of university libraries, there is an expectation of research and publication, and we don't have the same expectation or even really permission. And so just the time to do it was enabled in part by the time that was saved by commutes being eliminated during the pandemic. But as far as things that were sort of interesting, so in the book, there's a photograph of a watch that B. Lily's agent used. It was it wasn't actually a watch, it was a microphone that ran, so you wore the watch with the microphone, and then the wire ran up your sleeve and down to a pouch that you put under your coat or something. And so he recorded it to wire recordings. And so we had separated that piece out from the B. Lilly papers to our recorded sound division, I don't know, many years ago. But they were kind of going through some things to try to figure out what we still cared about, and that watch came to the surface. And so it was, I got to learn about the watch. And you know, I don't know that if I hadn't been obsessed with bootlegs at the moment, like whether we would have looked at the watch quite so seriously. I don't know.
What about what would be like the chapter for the present day and the impact of like the internet and the intensively restrictive copyright regime that has sort of come into play in the age of the internet and how that is shaping fandom, and I wonder how, if you would add like a kind of second part to that question is maybe would you add a chapter on social media fan participation, or so what, yeah, like can you update it or extend it to other fields? I mean, I think this extends to other fields, but yeah.
Yes, the last chapter does look at some of the newer technologies that were emerging during the pandemic. It's very much the book is in some ways very much a pandemic book, both in its the way that the time allowed me to write it, but also the things that were going on in the moment where almost all theater was mediated in some way for a year or two. I think that the interesting things are the ways in which the new bootleg recordings on YouTube really do serve as foundational texts for new musical theater fans and in some ways scholars. I mean, Wicked, Stacey Wolf has written about the way in which the teenage girls that she talks to as part of Changed for Good have been argue about who the best alphabet is or who performed the song the best, and have a very like sophisticated way of talking about the differences in performance choices that are only documented on those bootlegs. So I think that access to what's going on in New York is very different than it was even, I mean, the internet was still around when I was in college, but it was a very different internet. And I don't know that there was quite the same up to the minute reporting and access to things. I remember trying to download the little clips that they put on the Martin Gare website from the London production back in 1998 or something. And it being very exciting that they were finally released, but it taking like a day to download them. So I do think that the access to New York theater is much greater now than it was in the past. I also think that the accessibility of artists is much greater too. So people can, the question of like how I found the bootleggers is, I mean, that took some digging, but like now, if you want to talk to somebody, your favorite person in the industry, there's a good chance you can find some way to interact with them on social media, and that I think creates different kinds of celebrity than maybe existed prior to that.
So the industry is still collaborating with bootleggers to promote itself in this and to support in a way its fandom, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah, collaborating is a difficult word, and it's very specific. The relationship to bootlegs is very specific from person to person. Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote a long screed against someone who had asked for a bootleg on Tumblr of Hamilton back before the official audio recording was released. And also in that screed, he also sort of tipped his hand that they had made the video recording that they were going to release commercially too. But in the book, I sort of compare the language that he uses to the language of the publishers of the first folio of Shakespeare that talks about in the past you were abused by essentially they say deformed versions of this text, but now we present it cured and perfect in its limbs. And the way that Lin-Manuel Miranda talks about the problems that he sees in the bootleg is that same way that he calls it a half iPhone shitty recording or something. But yeah, this concern about quality is at least part of his concern. And then he led an effort along with Jason Robert Brown and Georgia Stett to write to people that had posted copyrighted things on the internet to ask them personally as Jason Robert Brown or as Lin-Manuel Miranda to stop doing it. So yeah, I think there's still differing opinions on the topic.
Is there another question? Yes, maybe.
Yeah, you mentioned, growing up and going to the library and all the cast albums were filed under soundtracks. And I know that in some cases, maybe that's a semantic difference, but do you think like along with musical theater being accepted academically, cast recordings sort of in parallel became more accepted as a separate category?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that a lot of that has happened since I've lived in areas where there's active theater communities that I've sort of retreated into. So I don't know, like if I were to transport myself back to St. Louis as a teenager, but today, is listening to cast recordings quite as weird as it was back then? I don't know. I mean, I do think that it's probably, I get the sense that, for at least from social media, that people kind of find their national or even global tribes a little more easily. And so cast recording listening is something that they at least find other people on the internet that are their age that like. But the differentiation, I mean, for me, the collating or the combination of cast recordings and soundtracks was particularly annoying because I didn't know the repertory enough to separate out what was like. I remember seeing The Color Purple of the movie version, and the album cover looked like a musical theater album. So I checked it out and was very disappointed that it was just instrumental music that would be underneath a movie. So I think that ability, yeah, when you're dealing with physical media, having those two categories I think mattered more, which may be why some of the older musical theater fans are so obsessive about the differentiation of those two terms.
Do we have another question? Could I ask everybody to humor us on the performing arts section committee and fill out our little 2-question form? So completely delighted that folks came out, and I'm so totally happy and honored that you came to talk about your book, Doug. We have the recording. We'll share that. And probably clip the front end where we're kind of sitting around talking, but before we got going. But anything else? Any more questions or comments? I'd love to talk about the forensic digital techniques for examining creative choices, but I think that's a whole nother session.
Yeah, I think
that would,
especially, yeah, I know it's a big deal to for an hour in the middle of your day.
Would be wonderful. Elise, anybody else?
No, I just echo your appreciation of Doug willing to do this, and I recommend the book highly. I don't know if you're all as big a fan of musical theater as I am, but definitely worth a read. It's motivated me to read the story of Vale Ballou. We just got rid of a collection of New Directions paperbacks, and a lot of the early ones were printed by Vale Ballou, so the connection to modernism is kind of interesting. Yeah. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and look for more announcements in the future and more activity on the SAA Performing Arts microsite as we kind of kick into gear more this year. Thank you all for coming and taking this time out of your day. Have a good night. Bye.
Have a good one.